Today is day 2 of Journey to Self's Inc. Please Ask campaign. I am Aniqua Acree, the founder and executive director of the Georgia-based nonprofit Journey to Self, or J2S for short. Our Please Ask campaign is a community engagement campaign. We are focused on bringing awareness to childhood sexual abuse while also aiding in the healing of survivors and providing trainings to people in children's lives so that they are empowered to please ask kids about sexual abuse. This next session features a returning speaker, Aba, and today we will actually get to hear her discuss how sexual abuse affects victims or survivors, as J2S states. But before we begin, please note that the information you hear today may be triggering. So if you or anyone that you know has experienced sexual abuse, please do not hesitate to call the National Sexual Abuse Hotline. Their phone number is 1-800-656-4673. So Ava, thank you so much, as always, right, for being a part of the Please Ask campaign. We were able to hear from you yesterday for day 1. But for those who may be new and just now are tuning in, can you still go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Alba Cordero Soto, and I'm a resilient trauma survivor.
Yeah.
I am a trauma liberation coach, an author, and a transformational speaker, along with other hats that I wear, such as motherhood. I'm also an addictions nurse as well. So that's a little bit about me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Yes, glad to have you. And so, with us focusing on survivors today, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is this notion that survivors of sexual abuse do not speak up. And so, on day 1, we spoke briefly about this concept, but I'm hoping we can just dig a little bit deeper today. So, Abba, what are your thoughts surrounding why survivors may not disclose their abuse right away?
So I think that the first thing is that, like, there's always some way that survivors do communicate that there is a shift and a change. So I think that everybody communicates and expresses that different, right?
Right,
So I think the key to really understanding I don't even think it's a myth of survivors don't speak up, but I just don't think that it's 100% factual that survivors speak up, because oftentimes they speak up in other ways, right? They could speak up in terms of all of a sudden they have this misplaced rage, or they have this silence where they're just, we all know, well, we don't all know, but anyone who knows Maya Angelou, Why a Caged Bird Sings, after her abuse, and she actually did speak up about her abuse, but once her abuser was no longer alive, she felt like it was her fault, so she stopped talking for years. So sometimes it's muteness or not talking. That is a way that a person is expressing that there's this internal suffering, that there's this secret that they're holding on to that is hurting them on the inside. So that's why this Please Ask campaign is so important, to be able to acknowledge when there's a shift and be able to ask those questions, to be able to help a person feel comfortable sharing. So that's one, right? But there's different reasons why, like, speaking directly and saying, hey, this happened to me, doesn't actually take place, right? So one of the reasons is that oftentimes the perpetrator is really good at what they do, in a way that they do this thing where it's like a grooming process.
Right.
And really make you feel as if you ask for this, or as if this is a form of expressing love in a very like you're special, you're one of a kind, so those things, in terms of a convincing a child that they're an active participant in that grooming phase, can make it so that the shame and the guilt disallows them to express this violation in a way that they feel like they allowed this. They feel like they participated in this act. Therefore, they're just as guilty. Therefore, they shouldn't speak up. So there's that. There's oftentimes threats that happen to children that say, if you speak up, I'm going to kill your pet. I'm going to hurt your family. I'm going to hurt your parents. So oftentimes these threats feel really real to children, and perpetrators will even go as far as killing a pet in order to show how serious they are about the threat to like kill something else or someone else that they love. Right. So it's also important to understand that sometimes the secrecy happens as a result of an actual threat that the perpetrator used as a way to silence the child. Another thing to understand is just like when it comes to grooming, oftentimes the perpetrator can have a very charming personality and very helpful and very, and that charming individual, it could be really difficult for the survivor to be believed. And if it's difficult for the survivor to be believed, because everybody likes Tommy is this, the favorite person in the family. And who am I to talk something bad about Tommy? No one's going to believe me because of this. Right. And unfortunately, many times when survivors do speak up, they're not believed. So there are also actual situations where survivors speak up and speak their truth and they're not believed. Their story is minimized. Their story is covered up, or it's like attention seeking or whatever it is that is used to really like minimize a person's reality. And that can be very challenging. So sometimes the fear of not being believed is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to speaking up, especially considering the fact that there is no proof. Like no one has body cameras to prove that this happened to them, right? So because it is my word against this person's word, and this other person tends to be an adult, and culturally, many cultures don't have a culture of believing children. Children are to be in their lane, to only speak when spoken to. So there are certain cultural norms that make it difficult for a child to be able to speak up and be heard.
Yes, so true. I'm so glad you highlighted just the nonverbal ways that survivors speak up, because I know me personally, and I've shared this in a few previous sessions of how I experienced sexual trauma at a very young age, under the age of 5. And while in that moment or during just my journey and my time of healing, I never verbalized right away that abuse happened, but my nightmares, my just this personality that I took on of nobody else is going to try me, and just this anger that I always exuded, especially when it just came to like other people or confrontational situations, I feel was definitely signs or my way of highlighting that something traumatic had happened. And it wasn't until much later in my late 20s that I actually started to speak up, mainly because I suppressed so much of the trauma, which then started to just alter my ability to remember it right away. So I had to go back on this like healing path of remembering my childhood to even resurface that memory of that trauma. So thank you, for just highlighting that. And then oftentimes we see abuse taking place within families. And that could be another trigger or another thing that makes a survivor just less likely to speak up. So can you enlighten us, Aba, on just family sexual abuse and how family conflict can affect a survivor?
This is a good topic. So it's interesting because not only do I have my lived experience, but because I work with survivors of sexual trauma, I have the ability to actually speak on other people's challenges as well. So for this case, I'll go ahead and speak about personal experience. So I'm a survivor of family sexual abuse. I too was sexually abused under the age of 5. And it was multiple family members that had abused me. And the interesting part that was uncovered as I was on my healing journey, and it wasn't until my aunt had passed away that I was able to understand the role of the mothers, the aunts, the caregivers played in pacifying and even enabling this abuse to take place.
Right.
And it's very, very interesting. So, for example, I have an aunt who has 4 sons. She always wanted a girl, never had a girl of her own. So she wanted to take me on as if I was her child.
Okay.
And I was her little girl, right? So she wanted to take me in. But at the same time, she had older boys who she enabled with the very like boys will be boys type of attitude, and didn't quite control the environment in a way that would keep me safe from her son.
Right.
And the way I was able to understand it, as I was able to kind of take a step back and really look at it after her passing, it was as if she was my handler. Right. It was as if she took me in and she created this environment where she enabled her sons and hypersexualized me at the same time.
Right.
So she would make comments about my body parts. I'm only 3 and 4 years old. She would make sexual comments about my body parts. She would say that I just never kept a diaper on. Like it was impossible. And she would go ahead and do things in a way that was very clearly unsafe for me as a child that can't take care of myself. And when it was found out that I was sexually abused, because there was some kind of penetration that happened, there was some bleeding, they covered it up. They covered it up because they didn't want her sons to be culpable, and they were younger, right? So these are younger boys as well. So we're not talking about 18, 19 years old. We're talking about other children as well, who were significantly old enough to know better, but weren't told better. So then you have this situation where you also have a lot of silencing that happens within family units. And the silencing is more so in protection of the family name. Right. Like we don't want to be viewed as that family. Right. We don't want people talking about us and saying that, this and this goes on in the family. So all of that tends to be minimized and hushed until another incident that's clearly caught and clearly happens comes up. And then they're addressing it as if it's the first time it ever happened. And then again, that gets swept under the rug. And then a little bit of time goes by and it continues to happen. So what happens with that is they end up creating little monsters. They have little boys that become teenagers, that become adults, that are now full-blown perpetrators who are able to do something as harsh as even violating their own children, because they've been enabled for so long to be able to do this in a way that's been pacified and even celebrated at times. Right. Because boys will be boys. And then what happens to the girls? The girls are told, don't wear that, don't provoke this, don't do this, don't do that. So then the girls are then, and then there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on as well in these cultures. In my culture, there was a lot of victim blaming. And then you have a girl that's been sexually abused from a very young age over and over and over again, to the point where now as an adult, she's experiencing what I consider coping skills of sexual trauma, positive or negative, doesn't matter, but a coping skill nonetheless of hypersexuality. And now that person is a problem. It's like, oh, she just gets around. She's this, she's a fast tail, she's this. So now you're actually, again, blaming the victim for a product that you enabled in the first place and that you created. And you're not able to sit here and honestly look at yourself and say that there is no root cause here. because you hid the root cause.
Right.
So
Right.
challenge when it comes to these family dynamics oftentimes is the secrets. And the desire to still have a family unit, even though the structure is clearly broken as a result of all of this trauma. So you still want to have family reunions, you still want to have Thanksgiving dinners, you still want to pretend as if everything is okay. And then when one person gets triggered and it turns into a debacle, it's like,
right.
You're surprised.
Wow.
You still got creeps and weirdos at the table.
Exactly.
Pretending like it's okay. And then one of the biggest challenges for me personally is the moment that a brave survivor decides to speak their truth unapologetically.
Right.
Then that's a problem. Because now it's like, oh my goodness, like, you're messing up the family name. Like, what are you doing? Why do you have to be the one to like say this? Like, can't you just shut up? Can't you just not say it? It happened so long ago. Like, why can't you just forget it? And it's very interesting that they feel that the survivor speaking up is the problem and not the person who committed the act is the problem. So it's almost as if the witness of a crime, the witness of a murder is actually the one to blame as opposed to the person who actually pulled the trigger. So you're gaslighting.
Right. Like, exactly.
So it's my fault that I'm speaking up about my truth and my story and my experience, as opposed to I was 3 years old.
Right.
I was 4 years old. And it's like, well, why didn't you speak up sooner? We could have Stop it with all that foolishness, because y'all knew, and y'all just wanted to cover it up. So if I did speak up sooner, you guys it would have just been the same exact thing.
Exactly.
Which is unfortunate in many households and in many families. So
yes, I definitely, of course, agree with everything that you shared. And then it's also, or at least what I've noticed as I've begun to heal. And unfortunately, a lot of the women in my family have already transitioned out of their physical form. So like my mom and my grandmother, my great grandmother, they're all deceased now. But as I talk to like my great aunt and I speak more about my experience with sexual trauma, it wasn't until then that I found out like the reoccurring theme of sexual trauma throughout my family, and how, my mom had an encounter, and then she was also like this product of rape, because my grandma was like 13, but her dad, my mom's father, was like in his 20s. So it's just so crazy to have gone for such a long period of my life thinking that this was something that only I, had experienced, because it wasn't talked about. So I had never known of my mom's, trauma, and I never knew of my grandmother's trauma. But it definitely motivated me to speak to my kids about it now, and to please ask, because I don't want that theme, and that trauma to continue to be passed down throughout our bloodline.
So it's very interesting that you expressed what I call transgenerational trauma. So the trauma that gets passed down from one generation to another, to another, to another. And the unfortunate part is that these are painful things, and it's very easy to avoid, to distract, and to not actually do the work that it takes to heal. It's very easy.
Right.
But the consequences of not healing are so far greater than you can imagine. And that includes passing that hurt, passing that pain, passing that trauma, passing that abuse down to your children. Now, anyone who's a survivor of sexual trauma can say, I would never want my child to experience what I experienced. And if you do not want your child to experience what you experience, the only way to break the cycle is to heal.
Right.
because that level of hypervigilance, that level of control, which we talked a little bit about yesterday,
Right.
only further creates a thing where it's like there are certain things that you won't talk about. There are certain things that you won't address. There's a certain way that you are that will only push your child away further.
Yep.
That will keep your child from speaking to you when something actually is going on, right?
Yeah.
So the level of hypervigilance that happens with a survivor, or the level of control that a survivor needs to have in order to feel this false sense of safety,
right,
all of these things that happen is ultimately what creates this problem, not creates the problem, but what continues to perpetuate, what continues to enable this problem and facilitate the problem to continue to move from one generation to another to another. So healing and really just doing some spiritual work to be able to break some of these cycles
right,
is ultimately what's needed, because I had to forgive my aunt the very same day that I acknowledged the fault that she had in this whole process.
right.
And what is it that I so quickly chose to forgive her? I quickly chose to forgive her because chances are she had experienced some of the same things, and she's just doing the same exact thing that she was taught to do. And therefore this cycle continues. So I have to forgive her in order for me to continue to live a life of liberation as opposed to a life of bondage.
Right. Right.
So it's essential. It's essential. So it's like there's a lot of work that us as individuals, as we are what I call what is it? Like when we're like overachievers, right?
Right.
It's like we'll stay busy just to keep the thoughts from the past creeping in.
Yes.
And that's a form of avoidance. It's a form of quote unquote healthy avoidance, right? Because then there's numbing.
Right.
Whether alcohol or addictions or any other, it could be anything. It could be sex, right?
Right.
That's also a form of avoidance. So avoiding the actual trauma and avoiding the healing is ultimately what will continue to keep your family under this level of bondage that you so desperately want to avoid.
So true. Wow. Yes. And honestly, that fact alone is why, we're sitting here today and we're sitting here having this conversation, because as I started that commitment to healing and to just journeying towards my true self by acknowledging some of those traumas, I was just like, wait, this needs to be shared while I still intimately, go on my own healing journey. I realized just how prevalent this sexual abuse, especially childhood sexual abuse, is. And so I wanted to have this Please Ask campaign, and I wanted to highlight information and topics like this so that not only, does the survivor get to focus on healing, but the family overall can sit down and start having some truthful conversations. And then, of course, I know that depending on the type of trauma someone experiences, they will have different outcomes. So can you talk a little bit about some responses that one might experience or exude because of sexual abuse?
Interesting. So we talked a little bit about a couple of them, right? And these are the things that I call coping skills, right? So these are positive and negative coping skills, right? If you're surviving, when you're on survival mode, there is no right or wrong way to survive.
Right.
Some things that lead to more shame and more guilt. And then that's the trigger or the indicator. Hey, maybe this is not the best coping skill. Try something else, right?
Right.
But some of the things that happen at an early age as a result of a person who's been sexually abused include masturbation. So anyone who now is like opened up to this pleasure sense, now mind you, it's if you actually look at it in a way that because just because you were sexually abused doesn't mean that your body didn't respond in a pleasurable way. That's this like you have your body and then you have your abuse different, right? Your body your body is intended to react in in a biological way. So now that you've been opened to this new world, in the sense that you now have these new thoughts, these protruding thoughts, right? And these nightmares. So like for me, I would have a lot of nightmares. And those nightmares would have me scared, but yet aroused at the same time. So then I would do self-soothing to help myself go back to sleep, which would only further feed into more guilt and shame, to show that, see, this is your fault. So you're the problem. So there's that, right? There's hypersexuality, there's substances, in terms of numbing, there's what I just called overachievers, right? So you'll have those people who will have, straight A's and like multiple jobs and do this and do that. And all of these things are a part of the avoidance or the numbing out or the distractions to actually like sitting in silence and remembering some of these things that continue to haunt you, for a lack of a better word. So the other aspect of it is also the resilience. So trauma creates this heightened level of resilience that is absolutely tremendous. It's unlike, and it's almost like you have a superpower now, to just be able to overcome so many adverse circumstances and situations, whereas someone else who may not have experienced trauma would have a very stressful time trying to navigate through some of these adverse real life situations. So there's resilience, there's heightened empathy. So you'll notice that these individuals have so much, like an abundance of empathy for children, have an abundance of empathy for other survivors. And oftentimes it's part of their purpose and part of their calling to be able to kind of give back or to heal or to create organizations or to be a part of the change, right? And that comes from this deep empathy for those other individuals that are experiencing those similar hurts or challenges. Oftentimes, it could lead to really toxic not work environments, toxic relationships as well. So it's like you feel as if you lost your power by this person taking something from you. So now you feel powerless or you feel weak. So if someone comes in that is trying to overpower you, whether it's a narcissistic abuse, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's whatever it is, it just feels like that is your place, that is your role, because you've already lost so much. So it feels familiar or comfort in some way, shape, or form. So that's also something that oftentimes happens when someone has experienced abuse. So it's just like, it's interesting because children don't really have that hypersexuality gene. They don't have it, right? So when you see a child that is acting in a very sexual way, that's typically a flag that something went on. And as opposed to making fun of the child or kind of labeling the child as someone who is, I don't know, fast, whatever, it's important to understand what happened, what is the cause, like what's going on there, and how can we be able to support this child to know that this is not normal. And that there are different ways to be able to kind of express yourself, and things of that nature. So I had another point, but I don't recall what it was going to be.
But all of those, especially the one that you just shared about how when we go through traumatic events, such as childhood sexual abuse, and that resilience that we somewhat, gain, I hate to say gain, but that we get from it. I never really connected my resilience to what I experienced as a child growing up, but it definitely made so much sense when you said it. And I was able to just reflect back on different just parts of me, different parts of my personality, and different things that I've overcome. And I remember just hearing people say, I can't believe, you made it through that. Like, oh my God, like, how could you lose your mom? And then 2 weeks later, like, you give birth. And I'm like, because to me it was just like something normal. Like, I'm so used to having to overcome or work extra hard, especially when it comes to just like my emotional state or keeping that sense of composure. So you sharing that, I'm like, wow, yeah, just wanting
There's
to acknowledge and uplift that some.
there's
And
also a
then
concept called post-traumatic growth.
mm,
So, and it really is the reality of that perspective, for the shift in perspective. So it's like
right.
PTSD is like, okay, you're identifying with the issue of the trauma.
Mhm,
The trauma is what is a part of your identity, and therefore it's what's holding you in bondage. So with
right.
post-traumatic growth, you're able to focus on what skill sets or what things had shifted or changed to help you
Interesting.
overcome that, right? So with the
Right.
post-traumatic growth, it is to focus on that resilience, that empathy, and things of that nature to help you overcome that.
Yeah, wow. And another thing that I want to highlight, or at least as it relates to J2S. So, one major thing that separates Journey to Self from other organizations that are doing this same type of work is the fact that J2S is a spiritual organization. And what I mean by that is everything that we do, every value that we stand on is birthed, in a sense, from this truth that we all are powerful beings. And that once we go within and we embark upon this self-healing journey, we begin to discover like our true selves. And this all leads to us just being more in tune with self, and then also just revealing and coming to terms with our purpose. And so as we're healing from something like childhood sexual abuse, Aba, do you think or do you believe that spirituality, and you kind of touched on it a little bit briefly earlier, but do you believe that spirituality plays a role in the actual healing process that a survivor may encounter?
Absolutely. I just feel like overall we're interconnected,
Right.
and you can't separate anything, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's something that happens when a person is sexually abused, and it feels like a piece of their soul dies.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and it really, the death is as a result of the shame and the guilt.
Right.
So for me, my journey to healing has been very unique in the way that I've utilized all different kinds of methods to heal and overcome different challenges. And right now, I have had the amazing connection with Jesus Christ as my savior to be able to help me with some of my, not some of my, but with the remainder of my healing that was
Right.
necessary for me to kind of overcome. And it just reminds me of just really thinking about the original sin, right? And this is
Right.
from a biblical sense. And what happened was is that they were now covered with guilt and shame, right? They felt the shame as a result of doing something that they were not supposed to do. So
Right.
relating that back to sexual abuse, when a person is sexually abused, that original sin and the result of that is that shame. So you have
Right.
that
Right.
shame, and that shame is oftentimes what you carry as a
Mhm.
backpack or as shackles that prevents you from actually living your life free of that, right? So when
Yeah.
you're able to work through your healing journey in terms of forgiveness, um, uh, being able to overcome the shame and guilt, being able to let
Right.
go of the bitterness and the anger, right? And do the work that it takes to be able to release that shame and that guilt,
Mhm.
that's when you can actually get to a state of really connecting with your spirit,
Yeah.
connecting with your soul, and remembering who you are, whose you are, and what you are called to be. because
Ooh.
those questions, is very difficult for you to answer those questions when you're overshadowed with shame and guilt and fear and anger. So once you're
Right.
able to release that baggage and let that go, when you were able to remove the shackles, that's when you're able to really tap into your spiritual self, your soul, and be able to ask those questions. And again, it's who am I? Whose
Right.
am I? And what am I called to be? And it seems very simple, but they're very deep questions that
Very.
only
Yeah.
when you have that connection, whether it's with your creator or whatever it is for you to be able to actually dive deeper,
Right.
you're able to answer those questions, because those answers are not rooted in your problem.
Mm.
They're not rooted in the issue that held you in bondage, and they're not rooted in the things of this world.
Wow. I literally have like goosebumps like all over me. A huge part of my healing journey has been journaling. So there are times when even if I'm not overwhelmed, I could be having a great day, but I still set aside time to be alone, and just reconnect and try to wash away all the information and labels and just things that the outside world, tries to put on me, if you will. And so during this just intimate one-on-one time, I usually focus literally on those questions, who am I? And not from just this outer vessel sense that, you see right now or that our viewers are seeing right now, but like at my core, so I do just a lot of meditation and I do a lot of research on just my people, my lineage, because another thing, that is big for me on this healing journey is discovering my true self, and not in the sense of what I learned at school in history class of how, my people or my ancestors were brought here, but like what was life before that. And so I think discovering more of just spiritual practices of melanated or Black people of color, what we did prior to just being brought to this country, and just the shift that happened with us has been a big part of me personally being able to tackle some of those questions that you highlighted. So I always just enjoy speaking with you, Ava. I always leave feeling so full. You always open my eyes to just other perspectives and other ways of just looking at things, which then leads to me being able to accept myself more. So I just want to just thank you so much, your experience, and honestly, your ability to educate like any audience that you're in front of makes you such a valuable addition to our Please Ask campaign. And I know we're getting ready to wrap up our session today, but I want to let our viewers know that they'll get to hear from you again on day 3 as we examine the life of an actual offender and just the different characteristics of those who tend to abuse or tend to offend. But until then, how can someone follow you and how can they support your work and just learn more about all that you have to offer?
So my website is albasototlc.com. And then I also have my social media platforms, which is Alba Soto TLC, both on Facebook and Instagram. And those are the best ways to reach me.
Perfect. And then, of course, with all of my promotional posts, and then under this exact post in this exact session, I'll be sure to tag those handles as well. And to everyone who is viewing right now, y'all, thank you so much just for your interest and your vulnerability and your openness to just learning more about childhood sexual abuse. Be sure to comment on this session, share your feedback with us. If you missed any of day 1 session that took place yesterday, we encourage you to head over to our Facebook, our Instagram, our YouTube, and take part in those life-changing, life-altering trainings and conversations. So until next time, thank you again, Ava. Peace, everyone.